Jerusalem. A name that carries the weight of 1,000 years. A city sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. For centuries, it has been the center of faith, politics, and the clash of civilizations. Every stone tells a story. Every wall has witnessed empires rise and fall. And in the year 1187, one man's courage, strategy, and mercy would determine its fate for generations. And today, we ask the question, what if he had failed? To understand what was at stake, we must go back nearly a century. In 1095, Pope Urban II delivered a speech that set the world on fire. He called upon the knights of Christendom to march eastward and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Thousands answered the call. They sewed crosses onto their garments, left their homes and families, and began one of the most dramatic military expeditions in human history. The First Crusade. The journey was brutal. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and battle before they even reached the Holy Land. But they pressed on, driven by one unshakable belief: that God willed it. After 4 years of suffering and sacrifice, in 1099, they finally stood at the gates of Jerusalem. What followed was catastrophic. The Crusaders swept through Jerusalem's streets with terrifying violence. Thousands were massacred: Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians. Holy sites were looted. The city that was sacred to 3 faiths was drenched in blood. The Crusaders celebrated their victory, but the memory of their brutality would never be forgotten. Not by the survivors, not by their descendants, and not by history. Jerusalem became the crown jewel of a new Crusader kingdom. Over the following decades, the Crusaders built massive fortresses, established laws, and settled into a land they believed was now permanently theirs. They seemed, on the surface, unbreakable. But deep cracks were forming, both within their own kingdom and in the world gathering against them. In the Muslim world, there was no unity to challenge them. The lands of Islam were torn apart by rival dynasties, political scheming, and personal ambition. Egypt, Syria, and Iraq were governed by competing powers who spent as much energy fighting each other as they did worrying about the Crusaders. The dream of reclaiming Jerusalem existed, but the unity to act on it did not. Not yet. Then came the man who would change everything: Salahuddin Ayyubi, known in the West as Saladin. Born around 1137 in Tikrit, he came from a Kurdish family of soldiers and administrators. From his earliest years, he was shaped not just as a warrior, but as a thinker, studying Islamic theology, governance, and strategy with equal dedication. Those who knew him described him as unusually patient, deeply principled, and possessed of a vision that extended far beyond his own glory. Salahuddin came to prominence serving under the great Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din, one of the most committed Muslim leaders of the age. He learned the art of war and governance from one of the finest minds of his era. And when he was sent to Egypt on a critical mission in 1169, he seized the opportunity, stabilizing a crumbling state, taking effective control, and beginning the process of transformation that would make Egypt a military powerhouse. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Salahuddin moved decisively. Through a combination of military force, skilled diplomacy, and religious legitimacy, he united Egypt and Syria under a single command. He had achieved what had seemed impossible, surrounding the Crusader kingdoms from multiple directions with a unified, motivated, and well-supplied army. The stage was now set. The final trigger came from an unlikely source: a reckless Crusader lord named Reynold of Chatillon. He repeatedly violated the peace treaties that had been carefully negotiated, attacked Muslim pilgrim caravans, and even made plans to attack the holy cities of Mecca and Medina themselves. These provocations were not just militarily reckless, they were deliberate insults to the entire Muslim world, and they gave Salahuddin both the moral justification and the political momentum he had been waiting for. Salahuddin had been patient for years, building his forces, securing his alliances, waiting for the right moment. Reynold's continued provocations made the decision clear. He assembled one of the largest armies the region had seen in generations, over 20,000 soldiers drawn from Egypt, Syria, and beyond, and marched into Crusader territory in the summer of 1187. But this was not a charge driven by rage. Every movement was calculated with precision. The Crusaders were alarmed. They mobilized every available fighting man: knights, foot soldiers, and the elite military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers. But a fatal argument divided their leadership. Raymond of Tripoli, their most experienced commander, strongly advised staying near water and forcing Salahuddin to attack on unfavorable ground. King Guy of Lusignan, under pressure from the aggressive faction, overruled him. the army would march across the open, waterless plateau in the brutal July heat. The march became a slow catastrophe. Salahuddin had cut off every water source along the route. His cavalry harassed the Crusader column constantly, arrows, skirmishes, and relentless pressure, without ever committing to a full engagement. The Crusaders couldn't rest, couldn't drink, and couldn't force a decisive battle. By nightfall, they were surrounded, exhausted, and desperate. Through the night, Muslim forces kept up psychological pressure, drums, war cries, and fires burning the dry grass around the camp. On the morning of July 4th, 1187, the battle began at a place called the Horns of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee. The Crusader army was already broken before the fighting truly started. Maddened by thirst, their infantry abandoned formation and fled up the rocky slopes of the hill. The cavalry, separated from their infantry support, made desperate charge after desperate charge, and each one was driven back. The sacred relic the Crusaders carried into every battle, the True Cross, was captured by Muslim forces. For the Crusaders, it was not just a military defeat. It was a spiritual collapse. Resistance crumbled. Thousands were captured or killed. Guy of Lusignan was brought before Salahuddin in chains. Reynold of Chatillon, the man who had violated every treaty and insulted every sacred convention, was executed personally by Salahuddin, a promise he had kept for years. With the Crusader army destroyed, Jerusalem lay open. But what Salahuddin did next shocked even his enemies. Rather than storming the city, he negotiated. Christians were allowed to leave safely with their possessions. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was left completely untouched. Priests continued their duties. Poor prisoners were freed at Salahuddin's personal expense. In October 1187, exactly 88 years after the brutal conquest of 1099, Jerusalem changed hands in a way the world had never seen before. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which had been used as a palace by the Crusaders, was cleansed and restored. The Dome of the Rock was returned to Muslim worship. Even his enemies, European chroniclers who had every reason to vilify him, wrote of Salahuddin's honor, his courage, and his justice. He had not just recaptured a city. He had shown the world what principled leadership could look like, even in the brutality of medieval warfare. But now, let us rewind history. Let us ask the question at the heart of this video. What if Salahuddin had lost at Hattin? What if the Crusader army had survived, Jerusalem had never fallen, and history had followed a completely different path? It seems almost impossible given what we know. But history is always closer to the edge than we realize. Imagine a different outcome. Perhaps the water shortage had been less severe. Perhaps Guy of Lusignan had listened to Raymond of Tripoli and chosen ground near the lake. In this alternate world, Salahuddin's army is defeated, perhaps even routed. His coalition, built over years of careful diplomacy, begins to fracture without the momentum of victory. Egypt and Syria, so recently united, drift back into their old rivalry. A Crusader victory at Hattin would have fundamentally changed the strategic balance of the entire region. The immediate threat to Jerusalem would have been removed. Europe, energized by the news of victory, would have sent reinforcements, settlers, and supplies. The Crusader states, instead of slowly collapsing, might have expanded, establishing a far more permanent European presence in the heart of the Middle East. Without Salahuddin's victory to inspire unity, the fragmentation of the Muslim world would have deepened dramatically. The unique achievement of his leadership had been bringing together territories that had been bitterly divided for generations. Without him, those old rivalries would have returned. The common purpose would have dissolved. Coordinated resistance to the Crusaders would have been almost impossible for a very long time. Without Jerusalem falling, there would have been no Third Crusade. Pope Gregory VIII only issued his call for the Crusade specifically in response to Jerusalem's fall. Richard the Lionheart would have remained in England. Frederick Barbarossa would have continued dominating Central European politics. Philip of France would have focused on his rivalry with England. The entire political energy of the late 12th century and the cultural exchange it generated would have taken a completely different direction. The economic consequences would have been equally profound. The Crusader states controlled critical trade routes between Europe and Asia. A stronger, more permanent Crusader presence might have reshaped medieval trade entirely. European merchants, backed by military power, might have established dominant control over the commerce of the Eastern Mediterranean, altering the rise of the great Italian merchant cities and the development of European capitalism itself. And the cultural ripple effects might have been the most transformative of all. The contact between Islamic and Christian civilizations during this period was one of the primary channels through which ancient Greek philosophy, Islamic science, and Eastern knowledge flowed into Europe, helping to eventually spark the Renaissance. A fundamentally different political outcome might have accelerated, delayed, or redirected these intellectual exchanges in ways we can barely begin to imagine. The consequences stretch even further into the future. The power balance created by Salahuddin's real victory shaped the conditions for the later rise of the Ottoman Empire and the modern map of the Middle East. A Crusader victory at Hattin might have produced a region and a world that we would barely recognize today. Different borders, different alliances, different conflicts, a fundamentally different path to the present. This is the most humbling lesson of alternate history. It is not just about imagining what might have been better or worse for one side. It is about recognizing how completely fragile history is, how much rests on individual decisions, weather conditions, the health of a single commander, one general's decision to listen or not listen to advice. The world we live in today is the product of 1,000 such contingent moments. Change one, and everything changes. But history chose differently. Salahuddin won. Jerusalem was reclaimed, not through massacre, but through strategy, patience, and mercy. And his legacy has only grown in the centuries since his death. Medieval European writers praised him as a model of chivalry. Dante placed him among the great souls of antiquity. Arab and Muslim writers across generations rediscovered him as a symbol of dignity and principled leadership. He belonged, in a way that few historical figures ever truly do, to all of humanity. Today, Jerusalem remains what it has always been, a city of profound meaning to three of the world's great religions, and a place where the consequences of medieval decisions are still being lived out. The questions that defined Salahuddin's world, about justice, sovereignty, religious freedom, and the ethics of power, have not been resolved. They have only evolved. Understanding where they came from is essential to understanding where we are today. One battle, one July morning, one leader's vision, and the entire course of history was changed for nearly 1,000 years. That is the extraordinary, terrifying, and awe-inspiring power of a single moment in time. And that is why we study history, not just to know what happened, but to understand how close it always was to going differently. And that is why Salahuddin's story and the fate of Jerusalem remains one of the most fascinating chapters in all of human history. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe and leave a comment below. Which moment in history would you change? Until next time.